Except 20.
Audio is activated. Ready?
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is Gad Lebanon. I'm Chief Economist North America here at the Conference Board. And welcome to a special webcast about expanding your hiring pool. I first want to apologize for the technical difficulties that we've experienced in the last several minutes, but all's well that ends well, so we will have a regular webcast moving forward. Let me start with a few webcast tips. You're welcome to ask us questions during the presentation. No need to wait until the end. You can just type them on the bottom left of your screen and we'll take them as they come. Also, you can get credit for participation in this live webcast, either the HRCI, SHRM, or CPE. You just need to type your full name, email address, and specify which credit you are looking for. I want to, before I get to the topic, I just want to present to you who is going to join me today. So first on my right is Frank Steemer, Associate Economist here at the Conference Board. Welcome, Frank.
Thanks, Gad.
And Elizabeth, hopefully she is in the DC area. Elizabeth, can you hear us? Okay. So we'll get her on later, but we will continue in the meantime. So today's presentation is part of our work on solutions to labor shortages. So you know, at the Conference Board already in 2014, we wrote our first report on the labor shortages problem, and indeed what then was a futuristic topic is a reality now for many companies. So we had several webcasts on that, and we're going to have a major report on the topic in September. In today's presentation, we're going to focus on one part of those solutions, and that's expanding recruiting efforts to underrepresented demographic groups. So what are those? So in the case of blue-collar jobs, it's also women. We've seen a large increase in the share of women in some blue-collar jobs, increase in share of minorities, people with less formal education, mature workers, disabled workers. We're seeing an increase in all of those populations. Some of it is due to demographic changes, but some of it is by intentional targeting of those populations by a company. So for the rest of the presentation, we'll start with a bit of a background on the labor shortages problem, but very quickly we'll get into this topic. And we'll both show you a lot of statistics of the type of underrepresented populations and what increase do we see in their share in employment, in what types of jobs. And we'll give you also some color, some examples of things that companies are doing, partly relying on our member survey, where labor shortages solution member survey. So just briefly, what is the problem that we're having? Well, the U.S. labor market is extremely tight, the lowest unemployment rate in 50 years, which is part of a larger global trend, but in the U.S. It's one of the more extreme cases of that. We got there because there are massive retirements of baby boomers and low to non-existent growth in working age population. So the supply side is providing less workers. It wouldn't have been a problem if on the demand side we would see a lot of automation and fast labor productivity growth, but we are actually seeing weak productivity growth in this expansion in the last decade. So that means that companies need to hire more workers to meet demand. And the third reason is that this is the longest expansion in US history, more than 10 years since the end of the Great Recession. So during that time, a lot of jobs have been added to the economy without interruption. And as I mentioned earlier, the supply side is not growing almost at all, so the labor market is getting tighter and tighter. What's very interesting is that we see that the labor shortages are more visible in blue-collar and manual services occupations than in the highly educated white-collar occupations, and due to several long-run trends. So a lot of the difficulties now in recruiting and retention is in the blue-collar and manual services. When that happens, the impact on businesses is very clear. There are measures of recruiting that are showing that it's now the hardest time to recruit since different measures were created. A historical long time to fill positions, very low and dropping retention rates, and also labor quality is becoming a major concern, especially among blue-collar workers. Also, we're seeing a lot of companies from our member survey companies are complaining about operating with unfilled position, overwork, as a result some lower morale, low conversion rate of recruiting, ghosting interviews, meaning that people are simply not showing up to scheduled interviews. And in the extreme cases, but becoming more common, companies have to turn down business because they simply don't have enough workers to meet demand. There's a question here, what is a WAP? From the previous slide, that's a working age population. Sorry for the abbreviation. So what are solutions that, when you think about labor shortages, what are types of solutions? So at the macro level, we can think of a few things. Immigration, if there are more immigrants, then we would have more workers. That's not changing in recent years, and given the current administration or immigration policy, it's unlikely to change in the foreseeable future. So that's probably not going to save us in the next several years. Another thing which is very much related to the topic today is labor force participation. Higher labor force participation, if we don't have enough people, increase in labor force participation rates could be a solution, and that's what we're going to talk a lot about today. There are other policies that could help, but at the company level, there are a lot of recruitment and retention solutions that we discussed in earlier webcast and we'll discuss in the report. There is also automation, but in this, we kind of put this put the topic of this webcast in the context. In a tight labor market, employers have to look beyond the demographic groups they typically hire from. So we are seeing that partly it's voluntary, partly it's not, but we're seeing a lot of those underrepresented groups that typically are less attached to the labor market significantly increase their share in employment in recent years. We are, especially when we talk about those underrepresented groups, we are talking about minorities. So here we'll show some examples of blacks and Hispanics, mature workers, people over 55 or 65, disabled, and in the case of blue-collar jobs, also women are an underrepresented group. So we see an increase in the share of those groups. Partly it's because of changing demographics. So, for example, the Hispanic share in population is growing, so of course it will also be reflected in their employment share. But that's only part of the story. Labor shortages is another reason, and we're seeing especially in recent years, very rapid growth in the share of some of those populations. And as from the survey, we find that many companies are intentionally widening and diversifying their recruitment efforts. Some more specific takeaways before we jump into the numbers. There is more women in blue-collar occupation, especially in transportation and material moving occupations. We'll show you some wow charts around that in a minute. Mature workers are making a larger share of the workforce, partly because of the demographics, but partly because they are delaying retirement. And especially in blue collar, the workforce is aging fast, and we are seeing a much larger share of people over 55 and over 65 in those occupations. We're also seeing lower educational entry levels, partly, but not so much because companies are actively lowering their educational entry requirements, partly because that's the labor that they have left that are still looking for jobs. So if we look at the share of high school grads or below, their shares in many occupations and new hires in recent years is increasing rapidly. That relates to also the share of blacks and Hispanics. Their unemployment rates are now historically low, and their share in employment is also rising across many occupations. And finally, the share of disabled employment also started to increase, but that's more visible in government-related jobs than in others. We'll show you some statistics on that. Just to kind of trying to summarize all of that in a couple of charts. So what we see here, we look at the share of disabled blacks, Hispanics, and people aged 65 and above in employment, in total employment in the US in the last couple of decades, and we see a very rapid growth in that. So these underrepresented groups are becoming less underrepresented, and they are growing very rapidly. So the kind of makeup of the workforce is changing very rapidly. In some occupations, it's even more noticeable. Those are transportation jobs. There you can see we're looking at blacks, Hispanics, women, and people aged 65 and above. If we add all of those groups together, what share they are of the transportation occupations, and we see that before the recession, it was less than 50%, and it's been accelerating very rapidly to 56% right now, and so very rapid growth rate in that. It's not surprising that we see such rapid growth in transportation jobs, because perhaps that's the ground zero of labor shortages in the US, especially drivers. That's where there is a lot of shortages, and companies in those that hire a lot of drivers have been dealing with shortages for longer than most other employers. So there is a lot we can learn from them. They are kind of proceed the rest of the economy. So hopefully, Elizabeth, are you already with us? Yeah, great.
I am here.
It's
Can
good
you
to
hear
have
me?
you. So you're right on time. So we use some of the, we had a long and large survey on labor shortages solution, which we're going to show you some of the results that are related to the topic that we have today. So Elizabeth, maybe you can briefly talk about the survey and what are some of the results that are related to this topic.
Sure. Just to give a quick introduction as to this survey, what we wanted to do was get a sense of what companies are doing to solve this dilemma. And through our survey, we had 225 total respondents, and many of them were more heavily weighted towards services rather than industries. So it's important to take that into account. We had many more in for example, healthcare and IT and services, professional services, and fewer respondents in industries such as manufacturing or construction. So that's one thing to take into account. If you want to go to the first slide there, can you move the slide one more? Great. So one of the questions that we asked our respondents is, to what extent is your organization having difficulty recruiting and or retaining workers? And you can see here what the responses were in the black segment of the pie. We had 28% that said that they were having difficulty only recruiting. And then opposite of that is a smaller, lighter blue slice where there were 6% of respondents that indicated that they were having difficulty only retaining. And in the lightest blue, the bottom of the pie chart, those that indicated they were having both troubles recruiting and retaining were 42%. So overall, you can see that the difficulty recruiting comprised 70% of all of our respondents. So the black bar and the lightest blue bar overall, whereas only 8% or 48% were having difficulty retaining. And those that were not having either difficulty recruiting or retaining were about 20% of our respondents. Can you move the slide one more, perhaps? So one of what we asked our respondents is to select the strategies that they were using in order to combat labor shortages. And one of these strategies was if they had expanded the target recruitment demographic, for example, starting to recruit minorities, veterans, or previously incarcerated, or other types of demographics. And the result was that 31% of employers that were experiencing recruitment difficulty selected this strategy for blue collars, whereas 35% chose a strategy for recruiting more white collar workers. The most selected strategy, however, was increasing wages and salaries. And that's expected. You know, that's probably what most companies think is the number one strategy that they can implement, is increasing pay and benefits. And benefits was also something else that was done with some frequency, especially for blue collar workers. But the lowest ranked retention strategy overall was to provide new incentives to retain older workers. And you know, we are seeing that that's one part of the labor pool that companies can take further advantage of with their recruitment efforts. If you move to the next slide. So with recruiting especially, there are some strategies that we found that companies were very reluctant to use, and those were all related to lowering employment standards. So for example, lowering requirements for experience, for education, for the types of skills and competencies that employers were beginning or had expected for several years, especially after the recession. And even accepting alternate credentials was not as common. And then there were some, but very few employers that were either eliminating or lowering the requirements for drug and background checks. So overall, it seems that companies they're struggling with labor quality, and this isn't an issue that they want to make even worse by lowering some other standards.
So most of the solutions related to this topic were not the ones that companies chose in large numbers. They may have to do it more in the future as labor shortages become more acute. But just to give a sense to our listener or to our audience, what were some of the strategies that were pretty popular?
Yeah, and what we found was that the strategies that were popular really differed between blue and white collar workers. So for white collar, or for white, yes, for white collar workers, for example, increasing signing bonuses, offering teleworking or remote flexibility, work schedule flexibility is something that other white collar workers also really value, offering moving cost compensation. And companies are really focused on the employee experience, especially for white collar workers. So offering stretch assignments or job rotations and job shadowing, anything that will really improve the quality of the job for the worker and make them have increased employee engagement. All of those types of strategies are what companies are primarily focused on for white collars. And with the teleworking, for example, you can't do a teleworking job in manufacturing or construction, so that is a type of strategy that really is only tailored to white collar workers for the most part. For blue collar recruitment strategies, companies are still using staffing firms to fill positions. They are expanding the target recruitment demographic, which we're going to be talking about throughout this webcast. They're also increasing efforts um, to improve the referral programs. They are integrating work programs or going through, integrating work programs with colleges, high schools, and trade schools. So this is vocational programs that employers are building relationships with these other educational organizations. They're offering new perks and benefits, shortening the recruitment process. The employers are really finding that if they have a recruitment process that's too long, oftentimes candidates will start looking elsewhere. You know, if there's too many interviews or it's taking too long, it makes it so that other employers have time to snatch up those employees faster. And then apprentice programs are another blue-collar related recruitment strategy.
Thank you, Elizabeth. We will get back to Elizabeth a little later with some commentary on some of the topics that we're going to cover. But I think the main message from the survey as it pertains to our topic is that companies are expanding to new demographics, but they were quite reluctant to lower qualification requirements and very reluctant, or at least they are not doing almost any attempts to get more older workers to stay in their companies despite the labor shortages, which maybe we'll talk a little more about that later. Before we continue, there are a few questions that accumulated in the queue, so I just wanted to go over some of them. So there is a question, is there any industry, there's a question if the No Child Left Behind is partly responsible for loss of blue-collar workers as funding has been diverted from high school shop classes to preparing everyone for college. I think that's one factor that we are seeing the share of young people with a BA growing very rapidly, especially since the Great Recession. I don't know if it's mostly because of No Child Left Behind, but it is happening. So fewer people are willing to work in those blue-collar jobs. Once you have a BA, that's not your desired career usually. Are there any industries that are particularly hard hit by blue-collar shortages? So as I mentioned, transportation, warehousing, that's very hard hit, and that's a lot because of the shift to e-commerce and home deliveries that significantly increases the demand for drivers and warehouse workers. Other groups that have significant shortages, I would say production and also health support workers. Those are some groups, but in general, in blue collar, we see, for example, we see wages in blue collar jobs and manual services rising much faster than in the educated white collar jobs in recent years. Why there is a weak productivity growth, that's a topic for an entire conference, but in 2 sentences, there are several potential reasons. One is that there have been false hopes that a lot of the low-hanging fruit in terms of technology replacing workers already took place 10, 20 years ago, and it's harder to replace the next one. It's possible that in this expansion, when mostly labor was abundant and cheap, companies had less incentive to automate, but now that labor markets are getting tighter, we are seeing more productivity growth and automation, so that could be part of the answer. I guess we'll know more in the next couple of years if indeed automation accelerates in a tight labor market. So those are some of the answers that questions that we had. So we are now moving to the topic of women in blue-collar occupations. So Frank, you want to take us through this topic?
Yeah, sure. So in this first section, we're going to talk about the attachment of women to the labor market. So let me just start with the more general comment, is that when we look at the overall workforce, we saw that labor force participation rates for women declined after the Great Recession. Basically, that happened for all demographic groups. But over the last couple of years, it has returned and is now already back to 2007 levels. I think it is especially interesting is that the share of women in employment is increasing in those blue-collar occupations, the ones you've already mentioned, construction, extraction, but especially transportation occupations. And we're going to see that in one slide later, that you can clearly see that there's a huge pickup, which is very interesting. I think another thing to point out is that even though we can be happy with that, it is a positive development if we put it in a more international context. So if you would compare the US to other mature economies like Europe, like Japan, what you can see is that actually their labor force participation rates are higher, or they have been growing much stronger over time. So it seems that there may be with some government policy, but also company policies that can help engage more women and attract more women into the workforce. So I think for employees, it is just always important to continue to review your workforce policies to make sure you're retaining and also attracting potential workers for your company. So maybe to go into the first line chart, and this is a very interesting chart, as said, what we're looking here at is the share of women in employment in these specific occupations. So what you can see is that at the start of this century it was pretty flat, but over the last couple of years, especially in transportation, you see that the share of women increased from 16% to about 18% at the moment. We also see the same is happening with construction. There we have plotted the data on the right axis. So overall the share is much smaller, it's 3%, but also there you see that it is actually a very significant pickup.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when we talk about these transportation occupations, as you said, that is kind of the ground zero, the occupation group where we see the tightest labor markets. It is interesting to look at some more specific occupations. So here we have listed a few. So you can see drivers, sales workers, truck drivers in the blue line, material movers in the green line, industrial truckers. And you can in all of these see that especially in the last few years, it has really increased. And we expect that this has a lot to do with also tighter labor markets. So with employers deciding, I need to expand my recruitment efforts. One note also on the taxi drivers and chauffeurs. Here you see especially a strong pickup, and this probably has to do with more rideshare service companies where women can choose their own hours and are not necessarily stick to full-time hours. So in that sense, it also brings me to this next slide and putting the US in a more international context. So here we're looking at labor force participation rates. So the black line is the US, and we compare it to Europe, in which we have divided Europe in 3 different regions, and also you see the participation rates for Japan. So basically at the start of this century, you can see that compared to Europe, participation rates were actually about the same in the US. But over the last 2 decades, it has remained about the same. And yes, in the last few years, it has picked up, but it is not as high as in northern Western Europe. So one reason could be that it is more common to have part-time jobs for women in Europe. So that also may be a potential solution for some US employers that are looking
workplace. And that's,
to increase
women want the same thing. They want to feel
the size
comfortable
of
and
the
they want to feel
workforce.
included. And some of the strategies that
But
companies are
very
using
interestingly, in Japan,
are listed here,
we
and
know
we can
that
go
labor
through
markets
them.
are
One,
especially
for
tight
example,
over
is
there.
partnering with
We know
nonprofit organizations to
that it has a
minimize
very
those
old
obstacles
workforce. So what
that are faced by women in these traditionally male-dominated roles.
we
And one example is
may
in the
be seeing
trucking
there is
industry,
that the
where women
problem
face
of
a lot of criticism by their male colleagues for the way that they are driving their
labor
trucks. They can also
shortages,
face discrimination. A
that
lot of the
government and companies
trucking
both see
stops
how
are geared towards men and have a lot of men, and make women at
urgent
sometimes
this
the
is.
female truck drivers can feel more uncomfortable in that setting. So there are organizations that help women
And
with
Elizabeth,
these deal with these types
you
of
talked a lot
situations.
to
Others, for
members,
example, other
as
strategies
part of, you did
offering
some
online
in-depth
forums to
interviews
give
with
women a
some of
sense
the
of
survey
community.
respondents.
Same
So
theme
what are
here,
some of
just
the
providing
things
an
that
online forum for that
you learned
dialogue for
about
women to
women
talk
in
about their
blue-collar roles
experiences.
in
Again,
changes
focusing on
in
the
recent
trucking
years?
company, trucking companies are now offering female-friendly vehicle packages that are ergonomically designed for women, that are smaller seats. They also have automatic transmissions rather than manual transmissions that are easier to, or physically less demanding. Again, in the blue collar trades and construction or other industries, companies are also providing women with workwear or other protective equipment that actually fits them properly. And this is also a safety issue. Women are often given gloves that are too big that might get stuck in machinery, or respirators that aren't, the masks are too large for their faces and heads. And also the same thing, fall protection harnesses are often a lot larger for a man than for a woman. So having just equipment that women can use and that fit them can make them more comfortable in the workplace and also make them more safe. And finally, recognizing female leaders. And this is something that the manufacturing industry has been doing a lot of. The Manufacturing Institute, their program, Science, Technology, and Engineering Production, their Step Ahead Awards. It's a program that is meant to recognize women leadership, to elevate them as role models, and to encourage other women to join the industry by having their companies nominate them for awards and how they're making a difference in their companies. So it's all about having that sense of community for the woman, and having them feel like they're a part of the company.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So there's a lot going on in this context. The next topic we are going to cover is workers with lower formal education, or another way to call it downskilling. For similar jobs now, people with less formal education are being hired. So we see this very clearly after the Great Recession and during the Great Recession. A lot of the people that lost their jobs were people with lower education attainment, but in recent years they are making a comeback, and companies have to dig further down in the resume pile, and that's where most people with less education are. We're going to show you some of that. It doesn't happen everywhere. There are occupations where certification obligations are very strict, and you can't hire people without a specific certification, like in healthcare support. But in many occupations where there aren't those restrictions, we're seeing a very rapid growth. Now, this is not a free lunch, and very much related to that is the increase in complaints about labor quality, or the quality of workers. The National Federation of Independent Business, for example, the number one problem that companies in that organization are reporting is quality of labor. It's more than any other business issue, and more than any other time in history in terms of this specific complaint. So it's not a free lunch. What we can see here is, if we look at the blue line, is if we look at all blue-collar, low-paid services and sales and office occupations, so those most occupations that don't require a BA. And we look at the employment in the ages of 16 to 24. So those are, we wanted to try to capture the new hires part. So many people in that age group are relatively new hires. So we want to see what percent of that group, what percent of overall employment in this age group is by people who don't have more than a high school degree. So you see that this blue line is dropping since the beginning of the century and until around 2013, 2014, and then there is a reversal. And the reversal is
Yes, and I think a lot of companies are focusing on recruiting students right out of high school now, rather than
in recent years, more and
recruiting
more
those
of the new
college
hires are
graduates. And
people
every
without
company that I talk to in manufacturing and
without
utilities,
any degree beyond
in
high
other
school.
trades,
So the
and
story
those other
about the
blue-collar trades,
baristas
they're
with a
all really
BA,
focused
that
on
was more
establishing
happening
relationships with the vocational
5-6
schools
years
and
ago.
developing
It's
their own
happening less
apprenticeship
and less
programs.
now.
That was by
Companies
and
either
large the number one
intentionally,
strategy that companies are using.
proactively, or
And many of them did
just because of
iterate
the
that they
supply
would
of workers
prefer
they're
to get
facing, are hiring
students
people
right
with
after
less
high school with no
education.
experience, so that they can really
As
mold
Elizabeth
them into
mentioned
the type of
earlier, we are
employee
seeing
that
this in
they
our
would like
survey.
to see grow within their own company. So they saw it as
Those
a very
are something
positive
that companies are doing, but in
strategy.
general,
The other
they are
aspect
not
that
declaring that they are
companies are
actually
doing are
lowering a
redesigning or
requirement.
creating new roles. So rather than
It is
lowering
mostly a
requirements, either for
reassessment
educational attainments or skills, it's about
requirements,
recalibrating those
but
jobs.
it's not
What are
something
the
that many
actual skills and
companies are
competencies that are needed to perform the
saying
jobs,
that they
and then
are
adjusting the job
doing. But
description
Elizabeth, you did
accordingly
mention
so that you
to
recruit the candidates and attract the
discover a
candidates that are
few
best suited for that role.
programs and
So again, it's
activities that
about
companies
setting
are doing in this
expectations about
context.
what you really need. A lot of times, these companies are also combining that type of recalibration with additional training. So maybe a job doesn't need 7 years of experience. Maybe you could get away with 2 years of experience and then add on some training program right off the bat, and also give that new employee a mentor that can really help them integrate into the company and learn faster. In terms of creating new roles, there are companies that are creating new junior roles that require less experience and education, again, with those lower requirements and more training opportunities. And in terms of the manufacturing industry, when I talk to companies, they found that a lot of young people have a very negative perception of what manufacturing is. A lot of those are old stereotypes of, based on, say, movies or, old movies as to manufacturing being an industry that is not high tech or old and dingy, whereas now manufacturing is very high tech. There's a lot of technology that is being used. It's at the forefront, really, in some of using of AI and virtual reality. So the manufacturing companies that I talk to focus on establishing relationships with their community and engaging and educating them on what it means to work in a manufacturing facility today. So Toyota, for example, has this program for students to compete about, what's cool about manufacturing in this video contest to really help get the word out amongst the young population that it's a viable working opportunity. And this other company called Thor Industries, which is an RV manufacturer, has facility tours for students where they can come and get to know and see what it's like to work in manufacturing. And actually, many companies do this. There's something called Manufacturing Day that's held every fall, where manufacturing plants open their doors to young students and parents and teachers so that they can educate the community in what it is to work in manufacturing today. So those are some of the programs that we are seeing that companies are taking part in right now to increase that focus on high school or lower educational levels of attainment.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And there are a couple of questions here. One is if we can say a little about what companies participated in our survey. So those are around 225 companies, mostly large companies that are members of the conference board, but also others across a wide variety of industries. So it's a pretty representative sample of the corporate America in this survey. There's also a question about if because of the lower education level, does it impact the safety safety results in transportation? I don't have off the top of my head data about that, but I can tell you that from talking to people in the transportation industry, typically now the people who are being hired are less experienced than they used to be, and there is from other surveys there are more concerns about quality, but I don't know for whether there is evidence that leads to more accidents, but it could be. There's also a question, which region in the United States that is experiencing the most challenges in hiring blue-collar or minority workers. And that's something that we are planning to still do work on in the future. I can tell you that in general, the area that is experiencing the tightest labor market in the US now is the Pacific. There is, especially California, a very tight labor market, a lot of growth in employment, but at the same time, there are many people who are leaving California in terms of population, leaving California to other states. So the labor market there is very tight. Whether it's especially in blue collar, that's one of the things that we are planning to study in the next coming months. So one of another topic that we're going to discuss are the topic of minorities, and especially Hispanics and blacks. Frank, you want to take us through some of that?
Yeah, sure. So let me go to the next slide. So when we look at the black and Hispanic population and their attachment to the labor market, when we look at the main employment indicators, we see that their share in employment is increasing across all occupations and actually faster than their trend in the population. So that is something that shows that the US population workforce is becoming more diverse. In addition, we see, as you already mentioned, unemployment rates for blacks and Hispanics that are now at all-time lows, and especially for blacks it is now 2% lower than in 2007 and also lower than it was in the late 90s. So that was like a time when it was an especially tight labor market. But also when we look at labor force participation rates, also there we see a pickup. So that is all good news. So we have some more specific charts on the black population. Let me just say a few words on what we see happening in the labor market when we look at just the Hispanic population. So there, as said, across all occupations, their share is increasing. Still, when we look at where they work, have the largest share, that is still blue-collar and low-paid services occupations. But when we actually look at the relative growth rate, it is they're growing the fastest actually in management and professional occupations, and after that in sales and office. So you see some kind of conversion actually over there. I think another interesting insight is that for Hispanic women, labor force participation rates are now at an all-time high. And we see it increasing for all women, but especially Hispanic women is something that we should of course talk about in this webcast. So maybe going into the first slide to look at one of the line charts. So what we're looking at here is the share of blacks within each of these occupations. So you see that around 16% of people that work in low-paid services are black. And if we compare that to the growth rate in the population, you see with the bubbles that the employment growth is actually outpacing this demographic trend. So again, reinforcing the point, the workforce is becoming more diverse. For blue-collar occupations, you see especially that it is picking up over there. And again, in transportation occupations, we see the strongest increase. Now in this next chart, what we were interested in is to look only at young black. So we're looking at the black population 16 to 24.
And just to mention, one of the reasons why we're looking at this group is that they typically have among the lowest labor force participation among any group in the US. So, and there we're seeing, as we can see here, especially strong increase.
Yeah, so what we have done here, we have listed some of the occupations where we see the strongest increases, and also include the occupations, so that is food preparation, where we now see the largest shares of young blacks working, which is almost close to 5% now. But you see that in also in office jobs and production occupations, transportation, it is now already their share in employment is higher than it was just before the Great Recession.
Yeah. So very rapid increase in some types of jobs in the share of minorities, and especially young minorities that are relatively less attached to the labor force. So that also beyond having business implications. It's something that is very positive for the society and income inequality and things like that. The next topic we want to talk about is the mature or older workers. We are seeing some trends there that Frank, you're going to briefly talk about.
Yeah, so as we know, this year unemployment of mature workers is increasing, which of course has mostly to do with the youth population that is aging. We simply see that the older cohorts are much larger than the young cohorts because, of course, over time, over the last decades, the fertility rate has declined. But interestingly, we also see that because of the labor market is getting tighter, that especially for companies that hire blue-collar workers, that they are trying to hold on to their mature workers because there are fewer entrants and fewer people that are able to replace these more mature workers. And this has to connect it to like an earlier question and the point you already made. We see that more and more people get a BA, and those people are not interested necessarily to go into blue-collar occupations. So another reason why we see a larger share of mature workers in the workforce has to do with retirement. So some people decide that they want to work longer, while others don't have sufficient funds, so they have to stay a bit longer in the workforce. But also has to do with a population that has now a longer life expectancy. So when you know that you're going to live longer, you need more savings to live your life after working. So maybe here I would also like to point out again on blue-collar occupations, when labor markets are especially tight in these occupations, that it is actually also especially struggling that even if employers want to keep their workers as long as possible,
some of these companies aren't
attached to their company,
keen on
sometimes it is just not possible after 65
older workers, mostly for safety and legal reasons, especially in the blue collar space. And I see that my video is working now
Frank,
at the very end, very timely.
You're running short on time.
So what companies are doing, they're offering phased retirement. Instead, especially for white collar workers, they're offering project-based work. One example was Michelin's pre-retirement program for older workers to help them scale back into a part-time schedule.
All options
a lot of what companies are doing is accommodating older workers by allowing them to take on more flexible schedules and also accommodating the physical nature of the work. So, for example, if there was a job that was done standing up, can companies change the nature of that job so that an employee can do it while they are sitting down? So thinking about those types of changes to the job. Job mobility is another big one. CVS, for example, has a snowbird program where pharmacists can change pharmacies and go from a cold state to a warmer state, for example, down in Florida, if they feel like they want to take advantage of the warmer weather. There's also apprenticeship programs for older workers. It's not just something for the younger generations. In order to retain older workers especially, it's about giving them lifelong learning opportunities so that they can maintain an active mind and body and more of a holistic approach. For example, there are companies that have their own apprenticeship schools for older workers, and Fidelity Investments, for example, has health and wellness courses that are targeted to mature workers. And lastly, this mentorship program, it's the other side of the coin of focusing on younger work, where we were talking before about companies focusing on students coming out of high school. This is the other side of that coin. So older workers really value having a mentee, being a mentor, and giving advice and allowing their institutional knowledge to be passed down from one generation to another. So Home Depot, for example, has an associate coaches program and many other companies do too, but this is just one example of that intergenerational connection that is really important with transferring knowledge within the organization.
Right. So we're continuing for a few more minutes to give you back some of the time that we, because of our late start. So the remaining topic that we wanted to discuss is disability. So Frank, you want to say a few words on that?
Yeah. So when we look at the disabled population, we see something very similar as what is happening to other demographic groups. The labor force participation declined after the Great Recession, but has now started to pick up again. And also when we look at the share in employment, we also see that more disabled people are now employed overall, and we see this especially happening in more government-related occupations. So like community and social services, and we see it happening in education and training. I think what is also important to note is that when we talk about the disabled population is to especially understand what is happening outside the labor force. So what we have seen is that over the last 2 decades, there was a very steady increase of people not participating because of disability. And in the last 3-4 years, we've actually seen a reversal. So that is maybe, let me just go to the next slide where you can see what I'm talking about. So what we're showing here is the share of people that are not in the labor force because of disability as a share of the population aged 20 to 64. So currently you see that that share is 6%. So we have seen a long run continuous trend, which we don't fully understand yet, but possible reasons have to do with the offshoring and automation of US manufacturing jobs. Another reason has to do with who qualifies for disability. And another reason may have to do with the opioid crisis and other health-related issues in the US. For us, it is, of course, what we are especially interested in is that we think that also the labor market may be one reason. So better labor market conditions are now pulling some of these workers back into the labor force. What I want to point out is that when employees are thinking about hiring for positions and that they may be willing to or maybe tapping into this pool, what is important to know is, and that is what I'm going to show in this slide, is that when we group it by educational attainment, that you can see that it is especially, or that it is not an issue for those with a BA or higher, that it is especially a problem when you, that especially for those with below high school degrees or high school degrees, you see larger shares of people not participating because of disability. So in addition to this breakdown, another important thing to point out is that it is not something that happens or is visible everywhere in the US. So what you see in this map is the share of disabled, of people not in the labor force because of disability
there are a lot of resources
in each state,
out there
in
for
the more
employers to
red
tap
orange
into
areas,
this
so the industrial south, but
population,
also
and
the Rust
it's
Belt.
important to note
You can
that,
see that the
especially
shares
for
of disabled people
retired
is
or
much larger
disabled
in these
veterans
states.
coming out of the
So
military,
this is also showing that it is especially relevant for businesses that have operations in this or in these states of the US.
But we're seeing, as you mentioned, some comeback in recent years, especially in certain groups of occupations.
technology.
Yeah, so that is
As at
what
the
we see
forefront
here.
in
So maybe
many-
just to quickly
in many
point out, the
ways. So
solid
these are
gray
highly
line here
skilled
shows the
workers.
share of disabled in overall employment, and you see that especially in
That
community
I
and
think
social
is an
services,
additional pool of
that there
labor.
we have seen a stronger pickup.
Yeah. Okay, and Elizabeth, you mentioned that you've seen,
that companies should
especially to the
overlook.
disabled veteran population, there are some efforts in that area.